Now we get to sonata form, which is sort of the biggie of the classical period. And in some sense, I like to think of sonata form as sort of the pinnacle of all of Western music up to the, up to 1770, 60, 70. You can almost treat the evolution of Western music at that point as the big rush to the development and final sort of evolution of sonata form as the way in which we cast instrumental music, at least first movements typically. And then it's almost like the rest of Western music from that point on is how do we break down what we have created and expand it and do new things with it. But the real reason we call that period of 1750 to 1810, 1820, depending on how you count it, the classical period, is that for Western music that represents the classical ideal. And we really do tend to talk about music before that moment, before that period, as really in terms of how does it begin to move towards the classical sense of harmony, the classical sense of melody, and equally the classical sense of form, which is what we're going to look at. And then we talk about music after 1810, 1820, as how does it deviate from that form, that harmony, that melody, So there really is something sort of critically important in understanding Western music, tied not only to the harmony and melodic structure of Mozart and Haydn, but also to the sense of form. And the two big forms that we'll talk about, sonata form most importantly, but rondo form, you may be familiar with, is a typical last movement, potentially, form that's used. It's simpler than sonata form, so it's good to dig into sonata form first, and then we can talk about rondo afterwards. But in essence, what we mean by sonata form is the structure invariably of the first movement of any multi-movement instrumental work. Be it a symphony, a string quartet, piano sonata, violin sonata, generally any sort of chamber instrumental work up to symphonic, or solo instrumental work. In the classical era, if it's multi-movement, the first movement you can almost guarantee, and there are exceptions, but you can almost expect, and then you'll see if it's true or not, but the expectation is that first movement will be in what we call sonata form. And then in a multi-movement symphony, for instance, each genre sort of has its typical structure, but for a multi-movement symphony, the first movement follows sonata form. The second movement is your slow lyrical movement, typically. It can be in a variation of sonata form. It can be themes and variations. It can be rondo. But the key to the second movement is that this is our slow lyrical. This is the beautiful melody moment. And then there are various forms that we can use to cast that. The third movement is the dance movement, and this sort of develops from the Baroque multi-movement forms, which we can go back and talk about. But typically this is your minuet. It's a dance movement. And the minuet, Haydn sort of champions, Mozart too, but Haydn the minuet as the dance to use for the third movement of a symphony. But when Haydn's the jokester, the surprise symphony, and there's multiple things about Haydn that we talk about in terms of wit in music is the term that's often used, but it really is just the idea of making musical jokes. He's kind of, and one of his musical jokes, the minuet, of course, is a rather moderate, fastly moderate dance in three, and one of Haydn's jokes is to take the minuet and speed it up to a tempo that it could not be danced in 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, and he calls the sped up minuet scherzo, which is the Italian term for joke.
Okay.
So it literally is a joke. But Beethoven basically doesn't write any of his 9 symphonies without a scherzo. He completely latches onto this idea that the third movement ought not to be the sort of slower, moderate tempo of the minuet. It really ought to fly at the tempo that Haydn has discovered. And so Beethoven doesn't always use the term scherzo, but his minuets invariably are in one. So they're the tempo of the scherzo, whether he uses the term or not. And eventually he does in his later symphonies. And then the fourth movement will either be in sonata form if the overall character of the symphony is rather serious, or if the character of the final movement is more playful and sort of happy rather than serious. Then rondo form is the form that sort of lends itself to that sort of character. And so this is for a four-movement symphony, and not all symphonies are four movements, and not all follow this exactly, but this is sort of the standard model. Okay, but the idea behind sonata form itself, and I'll check my time. In the biggest picture, is that we have an opening part that we call the exposition. And the exposition is where two thematic groups are presented. There's an opening set of themes, and depends on which textbook you're looking at as to what they call this opening part. Is it theme one? Is it group one? Is it section one? Theme one traditionally was the term that was used for the opening section of the exposition, but many theorists begin to point out that there can be multiple themes at the beginning, not just one melody. And so the idea of using group one or section one sort of caught on. I used section one, just had to pick one. And so the opening part of the exposition is this section one, which is basically just our opening tune, or sets of tunes, that most importantly are in the tonic key, be it major or minor. Okay. Then we modulate. There is a phrase, and we talked about transitional function last time, there is a phrase that moves us to the next key. And again, the typical Mozart-Haydn schemes, without exception to my knowledge, but there's probably some exception out there, is from the tonic in major to the dominant to the relative major from tonic in minor keys. But once we have arrived at this new key, then we have a brand new melody, or in the case of Haydn, often he will repeat the opening theme just now in the new key. It's called a monothematic sonata, and we'll get to that. Okay? But the idea is that we move from the tonic key to our new key, and now we have either a repeat of the opening melody, but more commonly a brand new melody to sort of announce the arrival of the new key. And then once we've done that, we bring the exposition to a close with terminative material, terminative phrases, which again we had defined last time, are defined by perfect authentic cadences that tend to be elided and repetition, either repetition of ideas within the phrase or outright repetition of phrases. And it's that repetition and elided perfect authentic cadences that give us that sense that the exposition is coming to a close. But it's coming to a close in the foreign key, not the tonic key, if that makes sense. And then typically, the exposition is repeated in its entirety. So if you're looking at a piece of music and you assume it's in sonata form, one big hint is to simply look ahead about a third of the way through, half to a third, and see is there a big repeat sign. Because if there is, and we're talking Mozart-Haydn, you can almost guarantee we're now looking at sonata form, because that is the form that's going to have that overall repeat. Later, post-Beethoven, Beethoven will use the repeat sign usually. Trying to think of any examples right off that he doesn't. None are coming to mind. Some romantic composers may write out the exposition repeat to allow for some variation, something different. Some tweak they might use instead of a literal repeat. But the repeat is typical, at least through Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven. Schubert, most of your composers will just simply repeat the exposition. Okay? But after we've done that, and I'll mention in later lectures as we start looking at this terminative material more closely, there are terms that we can use to describe the phrases here. I'm just not going to get into that right now because that gets a little tricky. You gotta look at some examples. But that's the idea of the exposition. So the exposition repeats. After that is done, check my time. We have the development. And we talked about developmental phrasing, or developmental phrase function, which is the idea that we are fragmenting some musical material we've heard earlier and sequencing it through a variety of keys to create tonal instability. Right? This is the section where we're just kind of constantly changing keys and modulating and hearing snippets of what we heard before. This is generally the part of the sonata that has the most musical interest and will sort of build a sense of excitement for the listener. And sometimes to describe the development, this is where the composer's sort of cutting his teeth, right? Because he or she is showing off what they're doing with what they've given you thus far. Okay? At the end of the development is a very important shift that has to occur, because what follows the development is the recapitulation, which is the return of the exposition in the tonic key. And so one thing that does have to happen at the end of the development, and we will look at this more in depth as we start looking at examples, is that we have to make a motion to the tonic key, be it major or minor, right? And that shift back to the tonic key generally will constitute the final sort of subsection of the development. So while we talk about the development as fragmentation and sequence and tonal instability and quick modulation, up until the point now it's time to get back to the tonic key, and then there's usually a phrase or two that simply focus on that modulation. Usually in a pretty exciting way. Back to the tonic key. Okay? The recapitulation is literally a repeat of the exposition with one key difference, and that's a pun. The key difference is you don't modulate in the recapitulation. So the transition, I didn't label that here, but this modulating phrase here we call the transition. The transition of the exposition has to be reworked, generally. And when we get to looking at transition specifically, we'll talk about some unique exceptions or sort of ways in which transition is handled. But the idea is that this time the transition doesn't actually take us away from tonic. Somehow it brings us back to tonic. And we'll talk about ways in which that can happen. But generally what that means is this phrase has been reworked. This phrase is not identical to the transition we heard here, generally. Okay? And so section 2 then of the recap is not in the foreign key following what is generally a reworked transition. It is still in the tonic key, be it major or minor. I'm not drawing the minor. Okay? And then we get all of section 2 and all of the terminative material that we heard, right, if there is any, all in the tonic key. And that's the significant difference of the recap and the modulation. Sort of psychologically, we talked about this. The idea is that the exposition begins at home and then moves and presents information that is not in our home key. And that musically this is somehow a problem or a challenge that has to be dealt with. Right? The idea of leaving home and exploring something new has to be reconciled, sort of in the psychology of Sonata 4. And the recapitulation does that. And that's a pretty important concept to sort of wrap your mind around, that the real point of the recapitulation is that it reconciles that which we heard in the exposition in the wrong key by making sure, by God, it's in the right key. You know, or you can think of it as, we left home, learned new stuff. We had some time to really think about it in the development, contemplate, ponder, what does this new information mean? And then not only do we bring it home, but we literally bring it home and restate what we learned in our foreign key back in our home key, if that makes sense. Yeah. The last point to make, and I've got just enough time to do it, is that it should not be overlooked that the concept of exposition, development, recapitulation is itself, they are rhetorical terms, and this matches sort of the standard model of rhetoric that's also developing in the Enlightenment, 1770s, 80s, 90s. The concept of, if I'm going to tell you something, I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you,